Good afternoon to all our listeners and viewers of the NDC Heatbeat podcast. We're happy to have all of you on this afternoon. It's just another beautiful Sunday afternoon in Grenada. Well, for today's program, what we will do is to share with you excerpts of the recently held, matter of fact, yesterday's General Council of the National Democratic Congress Party. This was held out of SAS Secondary School out of Grenville, and it was really fantastic indeed. Join us as you get excerpts of the political leaders' statement at that General Council meeting. Then what we will also do is to share with you the Prime Minister's presentation as the guest speaker at the 19th Sir Archibald Ned Memorial Lecture, which was put on by the Bar Association, and his presentation was entitled Reparations, Republicanism, and the Rule of Law. What next after 50 years of independence? Very interesting program. Join us today on the Heartbeat. Back with you in a moment.
When it comes to the National Democratic Congress and the membership of the National Democratic Congress, share the love. Why vote for NDC? Why join NDC? It comes back to values. You have to be able to say, this is what I stand for. And I want to make this point. We stand for workers' rights. Let me repeat that. We stand for workers' rights. So when they ask, it's simple. Who paid the public servants' pensions? Who went to buy monthly payment? Who is going to give them Imani's $500 increase in the new budget that's coming up? Who removed the tuition and TAMCC and new loan? Who is going to remove the $1 and the $3 from the school feeding program so your children could get food in school? Who spent the last year making sure we have consultations on minimum wage and going to increase the minimum wage? Who has never once criticized a union leader or a labor leader? So when I talk about making sure that we are proud and confident, there's nothing to hide or be ashamed about. And we should be prepared to take them on anytime, any place, anywhere. Who is going to give people 65 and over and people who are disabled or mentally challenged $200 increase in seed from the new budget?
It is my immense pleasure this evening to introduce our featured speaker, the Honorable Dickon Mitchell, Grenada's 9th Prime Minister and a fellow colleague in legal practice to many of us present here tonight. A man of humble beginnings, Dickon Mitchell's story is one of distinction and success, forged from hard work, determination, and a deep desire for betterment. He began his service to Grenada in 1996, serving for 2 years as a teacher at his alma mater, the Presentation Brothers College. This 2-year stint allowed him to appreciate the full spectrum of the educational experience in Grenada and cemented his desire to do more by advocating for the educational advancement of all Grenadians. In 1998, he enrolled at the University of the West Indies in pursuit of a law degree. After completing the Hugh Wooding Law School in Trinidad, his commitment to serve Grenada brought him straight home, where he commenced his law practice at the law firm of Grant Joseph & Co., where he immediately distinguished himself as a formidable lawyer representing many individuals and business entities. 3 years later, he would go on to acquire the law firm of Grant Joseph & Co. In 2016, Dickon Mitchell opened another law firm, Mitchell & Co., a maneuver strongly influenced by his vision to create more employment for young and upcoming lawyers. His ambitions having been always tethered to the desire to give back, and as such, he never divorced himself from the community. His collective experiences as a teacher, lawyer, mentor, and youth advocate shaped his commitment to Grenada and motivated his decision to enter the political arena. On June 23, 2022, only 8 months into his political career, Dickon Mitchell led his party to victory, and he was sworn in as Prime Minister of Grenada on the 24th June 2022. As Prime Minister, the Honorable Dickon Mitchell is working with his cabinet of ministers to move Grenada forward, building the foundation for an equitable society that takes pride in its culture, heritage, and identity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in raising a round of applause as we welcome to the podium our featured speaker, the Honorable Prime Minister, Dickon Mitchell.
Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I feel humbled to be asked to share some thoughts on the topic chosen for this evening's lecture. I say thoughts because I'm mindful, having participated in this lecture series for perhaps 17 or 18 of the 19 years, that at 7 o'clock in the evening, you probably don't want to be lecturing anybody. So I will share some thoughts. There are instances when I will indicate that it's my own personal opinion, and there are instances where I'm simply giving you views in the hope that we can have a conversation about reparations, republicanism, and the rule of law. The 3 R's: reparations, republicanism, and the rule of law. And it's perhaps not lost on me that the 4th R, Robert, who I just quoted to start the conversation, also starts with R. What next after 50 years of independence? I will leave reparations as the last bit to talk about. I will spend a little time on the rule of law, republicanism, and then reparations. I'm mindful that we have quite a few lawyers in the audience, but I'm also mindful that there are many non-lawyers in the audience. And I think I've quickly forgotten what it is to be a lawyer, so I would try to speak in as plain terms as I can on this concept of the rule of law. To a large extent, scholars, lawyers, legal academicians view the rule of law as the mechanism or the process or the institutions or the practice or the norms or the body of law upon which a state is founded that secures a form of government that is subject to and bound by the law. In contradistinction to a government or a power or an authority that is not subject to the law of the land or the law of the state. And to a large extent, this concept is perhaps most prevalent in what I call Western liberal democratic societies. And in the case of Grenada, for instance, and most of the Commonwealth Caribbean, it dates back to the United Kingdom and what is oftentimes viewed as the UK's own revolution when the Magna Carta was created. Prior to that, the United Kingdom had a system of absolute monarchy, which essentially meant that the king ruled with absolute power, with absolute discretion. And it was not until the Magna Carta that his power was curtailed or made subject to what eventually became the legislature or the UK Parliament in modern times. And essentially, the laws created by the UK Parliament curtailed or subjected the monarch and curtailed the powers of the monarch and subjected the monarch to the law of the land. And so the United Kingdom is now known as a constitutional monarchy with largely ceremonial powers and with the real decision-making power resting with the legislature. And the legal scholars will tell the non-legal scholars that the United Kingdom is peculiar in that it's one of the few modern liberal democracies that does not have a written constitution. In the liberal democracies that have a written constitution, there's an actual document that forms the basis for the organization of the state, and in many instances, the creation of the three main institutions that constitutes the state: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. In the case of the United Kingdom, the legislature is seen as all-powerful because it is not subject to a written constitution, and to some extent is perceived as having unfettered power to change and make law at will, as distinct from a legislature that has to make law or change law in accordance with a written constitution, as obtains in most of the former colonies of the United Kingdom within the Caribbean. So in the case of Grenada, for instance, we have a written constitution, we have a parliament that has to make law in accordance with the constitution, and whose lawmaking procedures are subject to being tested by the judiciary to ensure that it is made in accordance with the Constitution. Now, the idea of the rule of law, in a sense, recognizes that the society is going to be organized on certain fundamental assumptions. For example, that each individual should be treated fairly and equally before the law, that each individual should have the same access to the law, and that no individual, especially individuals who hold power, are above the rule of law. This requires a society to at least accept or acquiesce in such notions. If a society does not accept or acquiesce in such notions, then the entire concept of the rule of law becomes redundant or meaningless. And to some extent, Grenada is unique in the Caribbean in that Grenada had a system of governance and lawmaking, if we may call it that, for a period post its independence, which did not subscribe to this idea of a constitution, and perhaps did not subscribe, in some respects, to this idea that the society, and in particular the government, should be subject to this Western neoliberal concept of the rule of law. And so between the period 1979 to 1983, Grenada essentially was ruled by decree. And a decree is essentially a proclamation by anyone or any group of persons who have authority or the ability to, in fact, so proclaim and to ensure that the proclamation is enforced. And so we would recall that between 1979 and 1983, Grenada and the lawmaking power was vested in the Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop, and the cabinet of Grenada. And I'm sure you would recall that the very first act, the very first proclamation, the very first decree, was in fact to suspend the Constitution. And from then on, all of the laws that were passed were known as People's Law number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. Now, there are certain advantages to decree and proclamations. It's fast, it's effective, you don't have the constant back and forth, and more often than not, you can get things done at a far more efficient rate than under a parliamentary system. And so I'm asking the question, 50 years after independence, has the time come for us to seriously ask ourselves,
whether the concept of the rule of law, which exists in a Westminster-style democracy, which we have, is suited for a small nation state like Grenada? Or are we better off with a system that allows those in power, we can talk about how they get to power, but those in power to rule by decree, to legislate by decree, to govern by decree? I've given some examples of the advantage of that. Its effectiveness, its swiftness, in many instances its certainty, and then followed up oftentimes by action. And so those who lived through the period of 79 to 83 can perhaps testify as to why that government was able to implement particularly its social programs and social policies at a rate far quicker than any government perhaps has since been able to, or any government did before. So I leave that question of what next and the conversation for us to have a bit later. But it's interesting because critics of this whole concept of the rule of law will point out that who is in power is perhaps more important than how they get into power. You see, the rule of law potentially spends a lot of time about the process by which one gets into power, rather than the question of whether the right people are getting into power. Because the wrong people could get into power perfectly legitimately. And what becomes of the society, what becomes of your country, is another question. And the world is replete with examples of persons who have gotten into power and who have governed and who did so perfectly under the rule of law. But their governance and how they've governed has been absolutely detrimental to the society that they govern. So there are many countries around the world which arguably does not subscribe to the notion of the rule of law as a basis for the establishment or the governance of a state or a society. And objectively, you may very well find that their citizens may in fact still have a better quality of life and may still enjoy greater freedoms than societies that are premised on the concept that the nation state must be governed by the rule of law. The rule of law also assumes, under Westminster parliamentarian-style democracy, that there will be an effective separation of powers. That the people who legislate, the people who are in the executive, and the people who are in the judiciary are going to be separate, are going to be distinct, and will carry out their functions distinctly. Now, in a pure theoretical sense, there are very few countries where this happens. Perhaps the United States of America is a classic example where it does happen. The people who sit in the legislature are not the people who sit in the executive, and the people who sit in the executive are not the people who sit in the judiciary. And they carry out their functions, all things being equal, independent of each other. In Grenada and many Commonwealth countries, that is not the case. The people who sit in the legislature and are the majority are the same people who sit in the executive. So there is no real or true separation of the legislature from the executive. And the idea that the people who sit in the executive are accountable to the legislature is in many instances a complete and total myth. And again, Grenada has proven this exception 3 times. In our post-independent history, we've created history by electing no opposition in Parliament. The effect of which is that the legislature became the executive and the executive became the legislature, certainly at the lower house of Parliament. And so even if you have the concept of the rule of law and the concept of the separation of powers, in reality, with no opposition in Parliament, there's no one to hold the executive accountable. There is no one for the executive to account to. And so the idea that there is a check on the power of the executive essentially becomes that of a myth. And so you could, in fact, even under a society that talks about the rule of law, that talks about the separation of power, end up, as we did, in a situation where the executive, save for the potential check that the judiciary may have on their lawmaking or on the decision-making via judicial review, that the executive could, in fact, end up with absolute power or near absolute power. Because with a 15-0 majority in Parliament, you could create an absolutely new constitution, save for perhaps that one check of a referendum. And I see the Attorney General smiling. So I say this to say, if you had an executive that was popular enough, and perhaps wise enough, that you can convince the population to go with whatever issues you bring forward in a referendum, even under our Westminster-style democracy, even under a society that says we are governed by the rule of law, with a 15-0 majority in Parliament, and with sufficient support from the population, we could fundamentally alter the basis upon which the society is structured. And that includes eliminating, for example, the independence of the judiciary. So that is why I raised the question of, even in the context of the rule of law, even in the context of a Westminster-style democracy, if that creates a situation where you could, in fact, have absolute power in the hands of the executive and the legislature, whether the time has not come for us to seriously have a conversation as to whether or not that system of governance is more farcical than real. So I will leave that question for the what next 50 years after independence. This issue of republicanism is often spoken of in the context of breaking the chain or the link with our colonial past. And our Constitution clearly says that the Governor General is representative of Her Majesty, or in this case, His Majesty. And it's interesting because the Constitution does not explicitly say how the Governor General is to be appointed. It says who appoints the Governor General, but the how is left to convention. And the convention is that the Governor General is appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister. Our Constitution has around 61 references to the Prime Minister. It has 113 references to the Governor General. And the idea that we should become a republic, or the idea of republicanism, certainly in the Caribbean, has to a large extent been a conversation about removing the office of the Governor General and replacing it with that of, in brackets, a president. But does that really make a difference? My personal opinion is that it does not. And frankly, for small states, to me, it is cumbersome, expensive, and undemocratic. The separation of the head of state from the head of government is something that small islands can ill afford. Grenada spends approximately $1.7 million every year on the office of the Governor General. In 10 years, that's $17 million. In an island that struggles to meet the health needs and the education needs and the infrastructure needs of its citizens. Almost all of what is assigned to the Governor General can be performed by other offices that, in addition, provide real and substantive services to the people. And I can easily point out, for example, the Chief Justice or a judge of the High Court could easily perform all of the roles for the swearing in and all of that that is assigned to the office of the Governor General. But more fundamental, the idea of republicanism is that the head of government should be elected by the people and not be accountable to the legislature, but be accountable to the people. So in the United States, for example, the head of government, who is also the head of state, because there is no ceremonial president, is elected directly by the people. Albeit some may say that the electoral college is not direct election. But the president is not selected from the Congress. In our system, the prime minister is in fact selected from the parliament by the governor general. Because if you cannot command the majority in parliament, you cannot become prime minister. And there is no better demonstration of the fact that you can have repeat prime ministers who are not elected by the people than in the United Kingdom. You've had several prime ministers, I've lost count now, who've governed this country, and they've not been elected by the people. They are effectively made and broken by the members of their party. And so you persist in having a ceremonial head of state, which is stable and handed down, and you have heads of governments who are not elected by the people and who are not accountable to the people, but in effect are accountable to a legislature. And you could have enough backdoor dealings that in fact the people who lead or become the head of government do not reflect the wishes of the people. And so even in the context of a Westminster-style system, one has to argue whether or not democracy actually happens. And so the idea of republicanism, if it is to be meaningful, to me, should reflect, one, no ceremonial head of state, certainly in small islands like Grenada. Two, whoever becomes head of state should be directly elected and be accountable to the people. And that means not being accountable to the legislature. That means the head of state or the head of the executive should be elected by the people. Those who wish to legislate can certainly also be elected by the people. And therefore, a truer form of republicanism is that which obtains in the United States. Of course, there are clear disadvantages to the United States system as well. And oftentimes you hear about the gridlock between the Congress and the office of the president. But one may argue that the gridlock is good because it forces you to negotiate and to compromise. And it checks arbitrariness, it checks absolute power, and it forces the parties to work together for the better good of the country. So in many of our Caribbean islands, we've had the conversations about the move to republicanism, Barbados being the latest. But in reality, all that we've done is replace the name Governor General with that of President. Dominica was the first to do it, or one of the first to do it. And similarly, you have a president that is also a ceremonial head of state. But all of the trappings that comes with the Governor General still exist. Trinidad and Tobago has done the same thing. You have a ceremonial president, and you have a prime minister. The exception is the Republic, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, which in fact has an elected executive president. It also has a prime minister, but the president is the head of state and the head of government. And it's the only Commonwealth or former UK colony that has done so. And so there's an opportunity for us to examine the Guyana model and to see whether it has been effective for Guyana as compared with the rest of us who've continued, in a sense, by still having a parliamentarian Westminster-style system, notwithstanding the fact that we, or some of us, have simply switched the term from Governor General to that of president. Now, in a sense, all of what I've said comes obviously from our history of governance. It comes from a colonial, post-colonial era that goes all the way back to the Atlantic slave trade. And the fact that we have a Governor General who represents His Majesty is clear testimony to the lingering, unbroken bonds between, in the English-speaking Caribbean case, the United Kingdom and our former colonies. And that takes us into the conversation about reparations. And I started with a quote by Robert, because the reality is, perhaps 99% of persons who live in the UK may subscribe to and share Robert's view. And they are entitled to ask, what does this have to do with me? I did nothing wrong. And even if my ancestors did so 200 years ago, surely at some point in time, this must stop. And the question, therefore, is what is the response to this? The response, I think, first of all, is education. It was not so long ago. Grenada is only becoming an independent nation, or it's only celebrating its 50th anniversary of independence next year. That is not so long ago. If you are a colony of a country, it means that country has conquered and has subjugated you. It has colonized you. And the basis of the colonization was first genocide of the indigenous population, then the imposition of the Atlantic slave trade, and the organization of the society to enrich the colonizer. And that basic system remained in place, certainly all of the formal trappings of it, until these small islands began obtaining their independence. And we only started in the 1960s. So when the United Kingdom, for example, left the Caribbean, the vast majority of the population was illiterate. How are you going to produce a nation state with illiterate people? There was no education infrastructure to cater to the average citizen. There was no healthcare system to cater to the average citizen. The economy was still designed to trade with the colonizer and to extract raw materials to supply by then what was already the third or fourth industrial revolution that was taking place in Europe and the United Kingdom. So the consequences of 200 years of slavery is 400 years of exploitation that has left us still largely underdeveloped, poor, marginalized, and subject now to disasters and threats created by your industrialization, in particular, the threats associated with climate change. So the conversation is about, using a UK term, leveling up and making good that which you made not good. It's a conversation about how do we ensure that, one, something like the Atlantic slave trade never happens again. And that is why the CARICOM 10-point plan on reparations starts with this issue of an apology. It doesn't start with asking for money or for material things. It starts with asking for an acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. And if 200 to 400 years removed from it, you have difficulty in saying it was wrong, then it says you do not think it was wrong. Then it says, if given the chance, it will happen again. And lest we forget, because we say that in November a lot. There's the British Virgin Islands. It's not an independent state. And in fact, last year, the UK threatened to impose direct rule on the British Virgin Islands. So the idea that colony and colonizer no longer exist, there's clear evidence that it exists. The idea that the inequality does not exist and that we should sweep it under the carpet, there is clear evidence that it exists. And so the conversation about reparations is not a conversation about black versus white. It is not only a conversation about slavery. It is also a conversation about genocide, and specifically genocide of the indigenous populations of the region. When the Europeans visited this region, there were millions of indigenous people alive. Today, there's probably less than 250,000 of them living. They are the most marginalized. They have the shortest life expectancy. They succumb to the most disease and are almost forgotten, including by the descendants of persons who were enslaved. And so we have to appreciate that reparations is not just about descendants of African slaves, but it is also about the genocide that was committed against the indigenous population and the several hundreds of them who are left alive today and who are still paying the price for having been marginalized over the last several centuries. We also need to appreciate that most of the Caribbean countries are heavily indebted because upon attaining independence, they had no resources within which to carry out, for example, the mass literacy programs they needed, to invest in healthcare, education, infrastructure development. So to do so, they borrowed. And they borrowed from multilateral institutions that are controlled by their former colonizers. And they borrowed at expensive interest rates and oftentimes on terms and conditions that destabilize both politically and socially their countries. And now we borrow to rebuild after we get hit by the hurricanes. So when a hurricane wipes out more than 100% of your GDP, as a country, you actually have nothing. In 6 hours, everything goes. And you have to start. And what do? You borrow. And who are you borrowing from? Your former colonizers. So it is not purely a conversation about race. I think we have certainly shown that we are perhaps the most tolerant people on planet Earth. I think most other places in the world could benefit from visiting the Caribbean and learning about tolerance. But what we cannot tolerate is the idea that we should not fight for justice. Is the idea that we should accept that notwithstanding that we've gained our independence, that's all that matters. That we've cut you loose and you're on your own. And fundamentally, we should never accept the idea that owning another human being is acceptable. Because you cannot have a state, a nation state, that is founded on the rule of law, that is founded on the basis of equality, if one human being could own another human being. And so when we speak of what next for the next 50 years, the fundamental question is that to remain a nation state, this fundamental premise that slavery, that chattel slavery, specifically slavery based on race or color, is something that should never be accepted or tolerated. And if there's one reason for keeping the rule of law, or if there's one thing that we should enshrine in the rule of law, is that another human being should never be permitted to own another human being, domestically and internationally. And I will conclude by saying the rule of law matters internationally, perhaps even more so than sometimes domestically. Because if not, what you would have is might is right. And it is the same might that is right that led to the Atlantic slave trade. So internationally, we need a rules-based system that subjects the mighty as well as the tiny to the rule of law, to ensure that the mighty doesn't enslave the tiny. And so, as a small, tiny nation, it's imperative for us that as we go forward in the next 50 years, that the fight for reparation, that the fight for a system of government which we may call republicanism, that is more reflective of our society, and to ensure that the likes of Robert would understand that I'm not trying to milk him. That is because we are tolerant, that he could leave the United Kingdom and come to Grenada, specifically Carriacou, buy land in Carriacou, and have the freedom to express himself in the manner in which he did to me. So, here concludes my little conversation. I'm happy to be part of the discussion. Mr. President and others, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for that most enlightening address, which has given us much food for thought. At this time, we will open the floor to questions to the Prime Minister, and I'll take the liberty of switching seats with the President so that I can be a little bit closer to the Prime Minister. And so we'll open the floor for questions, and in the interest of time and to facilitate as many questions as possible, we ask, I see you, Brother Jerry, immediately. We ask that if you have comments as opposed to questions, we keep the comments for the end, but we keep the questions first. I'll open the floor to you, Brother Jerry. And please indicate by raise of hand so that we can see you, or make your way up to the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. Grateful. And pleasant good afternoon to my Prime Minister, my President of the Bar, and my colleagues here. And a love supreme to everyone here. Good afternoon, members of the Bar and the general public. Mr. Prime Minister, I wonder what your thoughts are on the lack of democracy, say, for example, at CARICOM. You know, there's a discussion about a Caribbean Parliament, and as you know, the framework is actually set out for a Caribbean Parliament. You were speaking of the one voice, the single voice within the governance structure, where, for example, the executive can be the legislature and likely marginalize other governing structures within the state. I'd like to hear your comment on whether you think CARICOM, or whether it's not time, rather, for CARICOM to institute a parliament in which all the political players get to participate in decision-making in the region. We can look at the OECS, for example. There's talk of an OECS parliament, but perhaps you put a lot of ink in that milk already, right? With the recent brouhaha in St. Lucia. I don't want to talk about that. CARICOM. It seems that Caribbean leaders themselves get two bites of the apple. They're the leaders at home, they go to CARICOM, they're the leaders in CARICOM with no other voice. I'd like to hear your thoughts about democratizing CARICOM. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, I think it really has to do with whether we can get greater political cohesion in CARICOM to actually create institutions like this. So, we could use the European Union as an example. You actually have a European Union Parliament, and that, to some extent, that does not take away from the fact that you still have your individual domestic parliaments. It would require politicians, because part of the challenge with our system of politics is that when you're in opposition, you support or you oppose things, and then when you get to government, you turn around and the very thing you were supporting, you either oppose, or the very thing that you were opposing, you support. And oftentimes the expediency of wanting to retain power drives almost all of the decision making. So I think we, as a society, we have to get to a point where, and I think that's one of the challenges, and I think it's gotten worse actually in the last 20 or 25 years. You can't change a society only through politicians. In fact, you're probably not going to change it through politicians. We have to get to the point where the rest of the Caribbean civilization, Employers Federation, trade unions, Chamber of Commerce, business groups, students, universities in particular, talk and advocate for the kind of societies we want. I think we all know that the people who have power never give up the power. You, to a large extent, have to take the power from them. So unless we get to a point where there is agitation, where students coming out of university are talking about things like OECS Parliament or CARICOM Parliament, the likelihood that a leader will say, let us advocate to lessen or weaken my power, once in a while you may find someone like that. But generally, you get into the system and the system will continue chugging along. So I think we have to get to the point where there's a lot more advocacy coming out of the education system, coming out of the academia, to actually start talking about what kind of Caribbean society we want 50 years from now. We don't have sufficient of these kinds of conversations. We need to have a lot more of that. And I think our universities in particular, now, sometimes people don't like hearing that. But the universities ought to be a hotbed of activism, ought to be a hotbed of ideas, ought to be a hotbed of revolution. I think it used to be perhaps coming out of, in a sense, the immediate post-colonial period, but we are creating universities where all we are frankly preaching is, or it seems to me the underlying value system is materialism, where the first thought is how well I can do materially rather than how well can I change or improve the society. To me, that's what education should do. It should make you want to say, okay, I've reviewed this, this isn't working, we can do better, and let's go in a different direction. So I certainly think conversations like OECS Parliament, CARICOM Parliament, how we decentralize power, how we actually get CARICOM to implement decisions that are made, is the kind of stuff that our universities or colleges should be pushing. Because if you can push those ideas when you're in university, you will get to power someday. And it will be a good opportunity for you to implement the sort of ideals that you were championing. But if our universities are not creating that kind of ideology, then essentially means when you come out, you just fall in line and you continue like everybody else.
There was a question from, sorry, sir, there was a question from this gentleman at the back with the white hair. Or is it?
Wisdom, Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Maybe they can just line up so we go.
Yes. And you can please line up if you want to ask your question so that we have an efficient,
I only hope we
orderly.
don't follow the American model, because in some states, the ownership of one individual by another still exists. But my question is, in order for us to avoid 15-0, where the executive become the legislature, or whatever you call it, have we thought about proportional representation? And the other question is, I would suggest that we look at the Singapore model of democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think it was a question. I think the comment is that one, we could consider proportional representation as obtains in Guyana, as opposed to a situation of whoever wins the seat, the one majority, because all you need is 50 plus 1, and you win, and the other 49 essentially gets forgotten, that we can look at a model where both the 51 and the 49 are represented. And the second comment was that we can look at the Singapore model of democracy. And I will certainly say it is worth looking at, because part of the challenge with a democratic Westminster-style system is it creates instability, particularly when it comes to policy and the implementation of policy. So this government says we're building a hospital. If you can't do it in your 5-year term, the next government comes and says no hospital. 5 years later, the government changes, you have to start all over again, notwithstanding that the policy initiative may be good. So part of the challenge we face is how do we get governance that could allow for change in personnel, but can at the same time ensure that we continue policies that are clearly good for the nation, regardless of who thought about it or regardless of whose idea it was first. I think that's one of the challenges we have with our competitive Westminster-style system of government. And the other countries, Singapore, for example, you may perhaps say China is perhaps the modern-day classic, because you've had changes in the leadership of China. The presidents have changed. But what you've had is a system where clearly the policy, the development plan have been followed, regardless of who the president is. I'm just using that as an example. And there are other countries where that has happened.
I believe we had a question from the, thank you.
Good evening, or good night. Standing on the protocol established, my question, Mr. Prime Minister, you spoke about the republicanism and the ceremonial role of the Governor General and the President. My question would be, if we were to adopt the process where they're both elected, what would be the check and balance? Would that be the referendum? What is the thought process? Should we determine, okay, we have a president and a prime minister. What would be our check and balance?
Okay, good question. So let me say my personal view. I don't think you need a president and a prime minister in a small place like Grenada. And I don't think most Caribbean nations need it. Having said that, there is one example where it exists, which is Guyana. There is a prime minister and there is a president. Places like Kenya, there's a president and a prime minister. To some extent in Kenya, the prime minister is essentially the president's secretary, for want of a better word. And the prime minister essentially is a cabinet minister, really, that does the bidding of the president. So in that case, there's really no need for check and balance because they're part and parcel of the executive. There are other countries where you have a president who elects or selects a prime minister from parliament, and the parliament, well, elects both the prime minister and the cabinet from the parliament, and the parliament has to sanction or approve it. And that prime minister and that cabinet then carries out to a large extent a lot of the work, the executive work. If the president wants to sack the prime minister, for example, he has to get the permission or the concurrence of the parliament. There are some European countries, particularly Eastern European countries, where that system exists. So it is possible to have a situation where you have a president who's elected by the people, you have a legislature, and the president selects a prime minister from the legislature with the sanction of the legislature as well as the other ministers, and they form the cabinet and implement the policies that the president wants to implement. If the president is of the view that they're not performing in the manner or at the level he desires, he can sack them. Usually, though, that sacking will require majority support in parliament. If it doesn't, then you end up with oftentimes a constitutional crisis, and you may have a situation where you don't have a cabinet. And in situations like that, the president oftentimes may rule by decree, because the Constitution may give him residual powers to ensure that the country continues functioning, even while they find a prime minister. So it is possible to have that check or balance where you still give the legislature the say in saying, yes, we support this prime minister and the cabinet who the president is selecting.
Gentleman in the, thank you.
Good evening to the head table. Good evening to all. Mr. Prime Minister, you have the ability to stimulate the imagination, and that's a great ability. But the imagination is one thing and the reality is the next. You have spoken about the idea that we find it difficult to separate the powers within our system, within our Westminster system, that the legislature and the executive does get itself tied up. Are you committed to ensuring that within your 5-year tenure, that steps will be taken to untie the executive and the legislature? That means, in essence, are you committed to us going through the process of a referendum and a constitutional change where we can have a constitution of the people, by the people, and for the people? I think our politicians also want the constitution of the politicians. So are you committed to having a constitution reform within your tenure? I'll stop here.
So the first answer I'll give you is a political one. As you said, commitment is one thing, reality is another. So let's deal with the reality of the current constitutional construct. You have to have a supermajority in parliament to start talking about constitutional change. Or you have to have an opposition that is prepared to agree with you on constitutional change. And therefore, you have to have both the government of the day and the opposition being genuine. In the absence of that, it will not work. And we've seen it. In the absence of a publicly agreed and stated commitment by all political parties, or at least the two main ones in our system, to engage in constitutional reform or revolution, and to jointly sit at the table together and to engage the public, it will not happen. So I wouldn't waste my time by trying to create constitutional reform from a government perspective alone. It simply will not work, because we will not have the majority in parliament, and more crucially, the other side is going to play political football, and their supporters then will not want to support it. So it would require joint, open, public, I would call explicitly agreed in writing. That's the only way in which I can see us moving forward on this question. And the reason I say so is because I will be very clear. My idea, and that's why I say constitutional revolution, I actually think our government is too expensive, it is too cumbersome, it is too slow, and it is too bureaucratic. There's just simply too much government for small islands like Grenada. And so it requires, in my view, a dramatically simplified form of governance that is more direct, more flexible, more nimble, and more adaptable. With all due respect, all of I mean, for example, we have a bicameral legislature, upper house, lower house, completely separate. Their processes are separate. And I'll give you a simple example. So to pass a bill, if you had one house, everybody's sitting, you debate, the majority say, yes, we move. We don't have this system. In the lower house, we debate, the majority say, okay, we're ready. You have to send it up to the upper house. That could be a month, it could be 2 weeks, it could be what have you. You have the back and forth. If it then passes muster, it could come back down to the lower house. By then, if the politicians in government are busy, etc., they can't put it on their schedule. Parliament doesn't sit for another 3-4 months. Whatever policy initiative you're trying to get, that gets thrown by the wayside. Something else takes it over. So the reality is, in my view, the constitutional change is not really a conversation about replacing the Governor General with the President. Barbados has done that, and what has happened? Nothing. Trinidad has done it, nothing. We all face the same challenges. It's probably worse to pass legislation in places like Trinidad or Barbados than even in Grenada. So the constitutional change, the conversation about the constitution by and for the people requires, in my view, deep fundamental conversations. It requires education, and it requires providing options. It requires actually saying to people, there's the Westminster style, there's the American style, there's the Singaporean model, there's the Chinese model, there's the PRG model. Let us talk about all of them, let us educate ourselves about, and then decide whether one or combination of them is better suited for us. That requires deep educating, public consciousness, and a willingness for the political parties to sit down face to face together and have those conversations. If that is not going to happen, we probably would have 200 referenda and nothing will pass, because whoever is in opposition will say, I am supporting it because they just don't want the government to achieve something, and when the government goes into opposition, they will continue the same thing. So I have said this, so my answer is it is unlikely in 5 years, well, no, it's 3.5 years, that the question of what I call constitutional revolution will get to a ballot box issue. But from an education point of view, and from having the conversation about what type of government we need for Grenada over the next 50 years, I'm happy to have the conversation and to be an advocate for that process. And I hope you will be an advocate for that process too, sir.
Thank you for joining the Heartbeat today. I hope that you enjoyed this very stimulating presentation, and join us again next Sunday. We'll do it all over again. Have a great Sunday afternoon. Goodbye.